Okay, I need you to stop what you're doing and focus on this for a moment, because what I'm about to walk you through happened so fast, so unexpectedly, that most people still haven't grasped the magnitude of what almost occurred. We're talking about a single social media post published in the dead of night that very nearly tore apart the most successful military alliance in human history. An alliance that represents over $50 trillion in combined economic power. An alliance that has kept the peace in Europe for 75 years. An alliance that, until that post appeared on screens across the world at 2 a.m. Eastern Time, seemed unshakable. I want you to picture this. It's late Saturday night, January 17th, 2026. Most of America is asleep. The White House is dark. But somewhere, perhaps at Mar-a-Lago, perhaps in a private residence, Donald Trump is awake. And he's angry. Reports would later emerge that he'd spent the evening watching coverage of European military deployments to Greenland. Small contingents, token forces really. Danish soldiers, German personnel, French troops. A few hundred people in total, sent to the Arctic territory as a symbolic gesture of support for Denmark's sovereignty. The context matters here. For weeks leading up to this moment, Trump had been escalating his rhetoric about Greenland. It started as an aside, a casual mention during an interview. Then it became a talking point at rallies. Then it evolved into a stated policy objective. By mid-January, Trump was openly discussing military options, economic pressure, even suggesting that Denmark was somehow negligent in defending Greenland's Arctic waters from Chinese and Russian encroachment. European leaders had initially tried to ignore it, hoping it would blow over like so many other Trump fixations. But as the rhetoric intensified, as Trump began threatening consequences for countries that opposed American acquisition of Greenland, they realized this wasn't going away. The deployment of European troops to Greenland was meant to be a compromise, a way to say, we hear your concerns about Arctic security and we're taking them seriously, without actually endorsing Trump's territorial ambitions. But compromise requires both parties to interpret gestures charitably. And Trump, watching cable news coverage of European soldiers arriving in Greenland, saw only one thing: defiance. To most observers, this was European allies trying to de-escalate. Trump had been making threats about Greenland for weeks, floating the idea of military action, talking about the need for American control over the territory. The Europeans were attempting to thread an impossible needle, show Trump they cared about Arctic security, his stated concern, without abandoning Denmark, their NATO partner whose territory Trump was threatening to seize. But Trump didn't see de-escalation. He saw defiance. He saw betrayal. And at 2:07 in the morning, he opened Truth Social and posted something that would send shockwaves through capitals across the world. The post wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Trump announced that 8 NATO countries would face immediate tariffs, 10% starting February 1st, rising to 25% by June 1st. The countries named were Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. All NATO members, all close allies, all targeted because they had, in Trump's words, journeyed to Greenland for purposes unknown and were playing this very dangerous game. And here's the critical part, the sentence that made diplomats across Europe wake their foreign ministers in the middle of the night. Trump stated the tariffs would remain in place until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. Let me make sure you understand what just happened. The President of the United States, using his unilateral authority to impose economic punishment, just declared a trade war against American allies, members of the same military alliance, and explicitly stated the only way to end it was for them to help him purchase territory that belongs to another NATO member. Territory that isn't for sale. Territory that, if taken by force, would spell the end of NATO itself, according to Denmark's foreign minister. This wasn't a negotiating tactic. This was extortion. This was the president treating the most important alliance in American history as a real estate transaction where he held all the leverage. Within minutes, the post was being translated into every major European language. Secure phone lines were lighting up. Emergency meetings were being convened. Because everyone understood immediately that this wasn't just about tariffs or Greenland or even NATO. This was about whether the entire architecture of Western security, the framework that has prevented great power war for 8 decades, was about to collapse in real time. Think about what was happening in those first hours after the post went live. In Copenhagen, it was 8 in the morning local time. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, was having breakfast with her family when her phone started buzzing incessantly. Within 20 minutes, she was in a secure conference room with her entire security cabinet. The discussion was stark. Denmark, a nation of 6 million people, was being economically coerced by its most important ally to surrender sovereign territory. There was no historical precedent for this kind of pressure between NATO members. In Paris, the response was fury mixed with disbelief. France has always prided itself on maintaining an independent foreign policy while remaining committed to Atlantic partnership. But this? President Macron's initial reaction, according to sources who were in the room, was to question whether someone had hacked Trump's account. Surely the American president couldn't actually be threatening trade war against allies over territorial acquisition. But as confirmation came through official channels, as the White House made clear this was indeed Trump's position, the French government shifted into crisis mode. Germany faced perhaps the most complex calculation. As Europe's largest economy and a country that had worked for decades to rebuild trust after World War II, Germany had always been careful to balance European solidarity with Atlantic partnership. Now Chancellor Scholz faced an impossible choice: support Denmark and face devastating tariffs, or stay silent and watch the NATO alliance dissolve into a protection racket where America demanded territorial concessions in exchange for security guarantees. The British reaction was telling in its restraint. Having just navigated Brexit and worked to rebuild its transatlantic relationship, the UK government was desperately trying to avoid taking sides. But when your closest ally is threatening economic warfare against your European neighbours over territory that isn't for sale, neutrality becomes complicity. By Sunday afternoon, Downing Street issued a carefully worded statement supporting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all NATO members, while calling for dialogue and diplomacy to resolve the situation. Now, before we go further, you need to understand what's actually at stake here. When we talk about NATO as a $50 trillion alliance, we're not being dramatic, we're being precise. The 32 member nations of NATO have a combined gross domestic product exceeding $50 trillion. The United States alone contributes roughly $29 trillion. Germany adds nearly $5 trillion. The United Kingdom, another $3.5. France, $3. Combined, these economies represent approximately 25% of global GDP. 1/4 of all economic activity on Earth happens within NATO borders. But the economic integration goes deeper than just adding up national economies. Over the past 75 years, NATO membership has facilitated the creation of the most interconnected economic zone in history. The United States and Europe conduct roughly $1.7 trillion in bilateral trade annually. American companies have invested over $3 trillion in Europe. European companies have invested over $2 trillion in America. Supply chains crisscross the Atlantic thousands of times daily. A computer chip designed in California, manufactured in Germany, assembled in Poland, and sold in France represents just one tiny thread in a vast economic fabric. When Trump threatened tariffs on 8 European nations, he wasn't just imposing a tax. He was threatening to unravel decades of economic integration. 10% tariffs might sound manageable, almost modest, but consider what that actually means. German automakers who've built plants in Alabama and South Carolina suddenly face a 10% penalty on every component they import from Germany. French pharmaceutical companies conducting joint research with American partners face new costs on every shipment. Finnish technology firms collaborating with Silicon Valley startups see their margins evaporate overnight. And the 25% rate scheduled for June? That's not a tariff, that's a wall. At 25%, many transatlantic business relationships simply cease being viable. You don't adjust to a 25% tariff, you restructure your entire operation around avoiding it. But here's what makes Trump's move so much worse than a standard trade dispute. This wasn't about trade policy. This wasn't about correcting imbalances or protecting American industry. Trump explicitly stated the tariffs were punishment for European countries supporting Denmark's sovereignty. He was using economic warfare not to advance American commercial interests, but to coerce allies into helping him acquire foreign territory. That distinction matters enormously. Trade disputes, even heated ones, happen within an understood framework. Countries negotiate, they compromise, they find middle ground. But what Trump did was different. He transformed trade policy into a weapon of territorial expansion. And once you cross that line, once you demonstrate that economic relationships exist only at the pleasure of presidential whim and can be weaponized to achieve goals completely unrelated to commerce, you've fundamentally altered what it means to be an ally. European leaders understood this instantly. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron convened his cabinet at 3 a.m. local time. The meeting lasted 7 hours. In Berlin, Chancellor Olaf Scholz cancelled his entire schedule and sequestered himself with his top security advisors. In London, the Prime Minister held emergency consultations with intelligence chiefs and military commanders. In Copenhagen, the Danish government faced a nightmare scenario. Their closest ally, the nation they'd counted on for security since World War II, was now threatening economic warfare unless they surrendered their territory. But the response that mattered most came from an office in Brussels. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, a former Dutch Prime Minister with decades of diplomatic experience, immediately recognized what was happening. Trump had just created the most serious crisis in NATO's 75-year history. Not because of the tariffs themselves, although those were damaging enough, but because Trump had explicitly conditioned the security relationship on territorial acquisition. He'd made clear that America's commitment to collective defense was now transactional, that it could be weaponized, that it was contingent on European countries facilitating American expansionism. Rutte spent the next 72 hours on the phone. He called every NATO member. He called the European Commission. He called American defense officials. He was trying to do something that had never been necessary before: prevent NATO from disintegrating due to American threats against a member state. Meanwhile, the economic fallout was already beginning. When markets opened Monday morning in Asia, European stocks plummeted. The euro fell sharply against the dollar. But then something unexpected happened. The dollar started falling too, because currency traders realized that if the United States was willing to weaponize economic relationships with its closest allies over territorial ambitions, then dollar-denominated assets might not be as safe as previously assumed. Why hold your reserves in dollars if the issuing country might freeze your access on a presidential whim? The sell-off in European markets was broad and severe. Germany's DAX index dropped 4.2% in the first hour of trading. France's CAC 40 fell 3.8%. The Pan-European Stocks Index shed over $60 billion in market value before noon. But the real alarm bells started ringing when American markets opened. Wall Street had assumed this would be a European problem. American investors would benefit from a flight to safety, with capital flowing out of Europe and into US markets. Instead, the S&P 500 opened down 2.1%. The Dow Jones fell over 600 points in the opening minutes. Tech stocks, many of which had significant European operations, were particularly hard hit. Apple dropped 3% on concerns about its Irish operations. Microsoft fell 2.5%. Companies with integrated transatlantic supply chains saw their stocks hammered. And then the bond market started flashing warning signs. US Treasury yields, which typically fall during crisis as investors seek safety, initially did drop, but by mid-afternoon they were climbing again. Bond traders were beginning to price in a risk premium for US government debt. The logic was straightforward. If America would weaponize trade relationships with allies over Greenland, what other supposedly stable aspects of the international financial system might be subject to sudden, unpredictable changes? Gold prices spiked, oil prices gyrated wildly, and most tellingly, bond markets started pricing in significantly higher risk premiums for long-term American debt. Investors were beginning to question whether the United States remained a stable, predictable counterparty. By Tuesday afternoon, the damage was becoming clearer. 3 major American companies with significant European operations announced they were suspending expansion plans. Caterpillar, which had been planning a new manufacturing facility in Poland, put the project on indefinite hold. General Electric delayed a joint venture with a German engineering firm. Boeing announced it was reviewing its European supply chain relationships, which involve hundreds of suppliers across dozens of countries. 2 European manufacturers stated they were reviewing their American investments. Siemens, the German industrial giant, quietly shelved plans for a new plant in Texas. Airbus began preliminary discussions about relocating some American production back to Europe. These weren't immediate moves, but they represented a fundamental shift in how European companies viewed American market access. No longer guaranteed, now subject to political risk. Trade groups on both sides of the Atlantic issued statements warning of catastrophic economic consequences. The US Chamber of Commerce, normally reluctant to criticize a Republican president, called Trump's tariff threat deeply concerning and warned it could trigger a transatlantic trade war that would cost millions of jobs. The European Business Council issued a more blunt assessment. Trump's actions represented an existential threat to transatlantic economic integration. And critically, defense contractors started quietly lobbying their congressional representatives, pointing out that NATO interoperability, the ability of American and European forces to fight together, depended on supply chains that Trump's tariffs would shatter. An F-35 fighter jet contains components from over 1,000 suppliers in 15 countries. Many of those suppliers are in the 8 nations Trump had just threatened. If tariffs disrupted those supply chains, American military readiness would suffer alongside European capabilities. But Trump wasn't backing down. On Monday, he posted again, doubling down. He claimed the Europeans were playing games and that Greenland was essential to American security. He accused Denmark of failing to defend Arctic waters. He suggested that if Europeans truly cared about the alliance, they'd understand why America needed Greenland. The rhetoric was escalating, and worse, it was working in reverse. Rather than forcing European capitulation, Trump's threats were hardening European resolve. Poll numbers across Europe showed massive public opposition to any deal involving Greenland. Danish politicians who'd previously advocated for increased defence cooperation with the United States were now calling for a fundamental reassessment of the relationship. Even traditionally Atlanticist voices, the politicians and policy experts who'd spent careers defending close ties with America, were questioning whether the alliance could survive a president who viewed it purely as a vehicle for American aggrandizement. On Tuesday evening, European ambassadors to NATO held an emergency meeting. 27 nations, excluding the United States, gathered to discuss the unprecedented situation. The conversation, details of which later leaked to multiple European newspapers, was remarkable for its uniformity. Every single representative expressed variations on the same theme: this cannot stand. Not the tariffs specifically, although those were unacceptable, but the fundamental principle Trump had established, that NATO membership meant acquiescing to American territorial demands. Several ambassadors reportedly pointed out the obvious historical parallel. What Trump was proposing for Greenland, using a combination of threats and coercion to acquire territory from a weaker nation, was essentially the same logic Russia had used to justify annexing Crimea in 2014. The very action that had prompted NATO to reinvigorate its collective defense commitments. And now an American president was attempting the same thing against a NATO member. The irony was almost too stark to process. NATO had expanded and modernized specifically to deter Russian aggression, and now the alliance's most powerful member was engaging in the same behavior, creating an existential crisis that threatened to accomplish what Russia never could: destroy NATO from within. On Wednesday morning, things reached a breaking point. Trump was scheduled to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Every European leader attending knew this would be their only face-to-face opportunity to confront him before the February 1st tariff deadline. But they also knew that public confrontation might only escalate the situation further. This is where Mark Rutte demonstrated why he'd been chosen as NATO Secretary General. Rather than allowing Trump's Davos speech to become a forum for airing grievances, Rutte quietly arranged a private meeting. Just Trump and Rutte on the sidelines of the forum, away from cameras and press. No large delegations, no formal statements, just two men in a room trying to find a way back from the edge. What happened in that meeting remains partially classified, but we know some details from subsequent statements and background briefings. Rutte apparently took a very direct approach. He didn't try to argue the merits of Trump's Greenland obsession. He didn't defend Denmark's sovereignty, although that was implicit in everything he said. Instead, Rutte focused on something Trump understood: strength. Rutte reportedly told Trump that the NATO alliance made America stronger, not weaker. That European military spending, which had increased dramatically in recent years, meant more forces available for American strategic priorities. That the economic integration between America and Europe created prosperity that benefited both sides. That threatening all of this over Greenland, a territory that would take decades to develop and whose strategic value was debatable, was trading certainty for speculation. But more importantly, Rutte apparently framed the situation in terms of perception. The entire world was watching. China, Russia, every adversary and competitor was seeing an American president threatening his own allies. They were seeing NATO fracture. They were seeing European nations question whether America was a reliable partner. And that perception, Rutte argued, undermined American power far more than any potential benefit from Greenland could enhance it. Trump, according to sources, pushed back hard initially. He insisted Greenland was critical to American security. He claimed the Europeans were being unreasonable. He suggested that if they really wanted to demonstrate alliance solidarity, they'd help him negotiate with Denmark. But Rutte had a card to play. He offered what he called a framework. Not a deal, not an agreement, but a framework for future discussions. It would focus on Arctic security, something Trump claimed to care about. It would involve increased NATO presence in the region, addressing the stated American concerns about Russian and Chinese activities. It would include discussions about mineral rights and defense installations, giving Trump something he could claim as a win. Critically, the framework didn't promise American acquisition of Greenland. It didn't compromise Danish sovereignty. It simply created a process, a bureaucratic mechanism through which all parties could discuss Arctic security concerns. But it gave Trump an off-ramp, a way to back down from the tariffs without appearing to have lost. And Trump, perhaps recognizing that he'd overplayed his hand, perhaps genuinely convinced by Rutte's arguments, or perhaps simply tired of the controversy, accepted. Within hours, Trump posted on Truth Social that he'd reached a framework of a future deal with Rutte regarding Greenland and Arctic security. He announced he would not be imposing the tariffs scheduled for February 1st. He claimed victory, stating the solution would be great for the United States of America and all NATO nations. The financial markets reacted immediately. European stocks surged, the dollar stabilized, bond yields retreated from their elevated levels. Trade groups issued relieved statements. Politicians on both sides of the Atlantic expressed cautious optimism. But make no mistake, nothing had actually been resolved. The framework Trump and Rutte agreed to is, by all expert accounts, essentially meaningless. NATO already coordinates Arctic security. Denmark and Greenland already cooperate with the United States on defense matters. The deal is, in the words of one senior European diplomat speaking anonymously, a face-saving exercise wrapped in diplomatic language signifying nothing. What actually happened is that Trump blinked. He threatened the entire NATO alliance over a territorial obsession, discovered that Europe wasn't going to capitulate, realized the economic and strategic costs of following through, and accepted a fig leaf that allowed him to retreat while claiming victory. But the damage is real and lasting. For 5 days from that 2 a.m. post until the Davos meeting, the NATO alliance faced an existential crisis. Trading relationships worth trillions of dollars hung in the balance. Security commitments that had prevented war for 75 years seemed suddenly uncertain. And the entire world watched as America's most important alliance nearly shattered because one man wanted to acquire territory that wasn't for sale. European trust in American leadership has been fundamentally shaken, not because of policy disagreements, those are normal and manageable, but because Trump demonstrated that he was willing to weaponize the entire transatlantic relationship to pursue a personal fixation. He showed that from his perspective, NATO isn't a mutual defense pact among equals. It's a mechanism through which America extracts concessions from subordinate partners. That perception will outlast Trump's presidency. European defense planners are already discussing what's called strategic autonomy, the ability to defend European interests without American support. Not because they want to, but because they've realized they might have to. France has accelerated its nuclear modernization program. Germany is dramatically increasing defense spending and restructuring its military for potential operations without American logistics support. Poland is building one of the largest armies in Europe. These changes were already underway, driven by Russian aggression in Ukraine. But Trump's Greenland gambit has accelerated them dramatically. European leaders now understand viscerally that American security commitments are conditional, that they can be withdrawn or weaponized based on presidential whim, that relying entirely on American protection is an unacceptable strategic vulnerability. The economic implications are equally significant. European companies are reassessing American exposure, not divesting entirely, the economies are too intertwined for that, but diversifying, creating redundancies, building alternative supply chains that don't transit through American-controlled choke points. This will take years and cost hundreds of billions. But Trump's 5-day threat has convinced European business leaders that it's necessary insurance. And globally, adversaries took notes. China watched an American president threaten his closest allies with economic warfare over territorial demands. Russia saw NATO fractured by internal American pressure. Every authoritarian regime observed that the Western alliance, the democratic coalition that's shaped global politics since World War II, could be destabilized not by external attack, but by internal American actions. This emboldens aggression. If America treats its allies this way, if the NATO commitment is this fragile, then maybe Taiwan isn't as secure as previously thought. Maybe the Baltic states can't really count on Article 5 protection. Maybe the entire post-war international order is more vulnerable than anyone realized. Let me be very clear about what almost happened here. We came within days, possibly hours, of watching NATO collapse, not because of military defeat, not because of economic decline, not because the alliance had failed, but because an American president couldn't accept that Danish territory wasn't available for purchase. To understand how unprecedented this was, consider NATO's previous existential crises. In 1956, Britain and France invaded Egypt during the Suez Crisis without American approval. President Eisenhower was furious and used economic pressure to force a withdrawal. But the alliance survived because the fundamental principle remained intact. NATO existed for collective defense, not territorial expansion. In 1966, France withdrew from NATO's integrated military command, but remained a member of the alliance. In 2003, NATO nearly fractured over the Iraq War, with France and Germany opposing American intervention. But in each case, the crisis centered on how to use the alliance, not whether the alliance's most powerful member would weaponize it for territorial conquest. What Trump did was categorically different. He threatened member states with economic warfare to coerce territorial surrender. That's not a policy dispute. That's not a disagreement about burden sharing or strategic priorities. That's the logic of empire, not alliance. That's how great powers behaved in the 19th century, not how partners treat each other in the 21st. The $50 trillion alliance, the security framework that has prevented great power war for 3/4 of a century, the economic zone that has created unprecedented prosperity, almost shattered over a 2 a.m. social media post by a man who couldn't distinguish between a real estate transaction and international diplomacy. And the truly terrifying part? This could happen again. Trump still wants Greenland. He said the framework deal is infinite and gives America everything we wanted, which European diplomats know to be nonsense. The underlying obsession hasn't changed. The willingness to weaponize alliances hasn't disappeared. The fundamental worldview that treats international relationships as zero-sum transactions, where only leverage matters, hasn't been modified. In fact, some analysts believe Trump views the Davos framework not as a retreat, but as a template. He threatened massive economic consequences, created a crisis, then accepted a face-saving compromise that changed nothing substantive. From his perspective, this might look like successful negotiation, which means he could attempt the same playbook on other issues, with other allies, believing that threats and brinkmanship produce results without long-term costs. So what happens next? In the immediate term, not much. The tariff threat is gone, trade continues normally, NATO conducts its operations. The framework discussions will proceed quietly, accomplishing little but maintaining the appearance of progress. But beneath the surface, everything has changed. European defence ministers are accelerating autonomy plans. Business leaders are building resilience against American caprice. And across the NATO alliance, from Ottawa to Oslo, from Lisbon to London, political leaders are asking a question that until very recently would have seemed absurd. Can we really count on America? That question, once asked, doesn't go away. It becomes part of every defence procurement decision, every trade negotiation, every diplomatic calculation. It fundamentally alters the transatlantic relationship in ways that can't be easily repaired. Trump's defenders will claim this was just negotiating, that he got movement on Arctic security, that his unorthodox methods work. But that analysis misses the point entirely. Yes, Trump got a face-saving framework, but he also demonstrated to every ally that American security commitments are conditional, and can be weaponized for territorial acquisition. He showed that the NATO alliance, from America's perspective, is a tool to be used rather than a mutual obligation to be honored. And that revelation, that moment of clarity about how Trump views alliances, will shape international politics for decades. Not because of what happened during those 5 days, but because of what it revealed about what could happen in the future. The 2 a.m. post that threatened to shatter the $50 trillion alliance didn't ultimately destroy NATO. Mark Rutte's diplomacy, European resolve, market pressure, and perhaps Trump's own calculation that he'd pushed too far prevented that outcome. But it came frighteningly close. Closer than most people realize. Closer than should ever have been possible. And the scariest part? We're still only in January of 2026. Trump has nearly 4 more years in office. The Greenland obsession hasn't disappeared. The willingness to threaten allies remains. The fundamental worldview that treats alliances as transactions is unchanged. This wasn't the end of a crisis. It was a preview of crises to come, a warning of just how fragile the international order has become when the world's most powerful democracy is led by someone who sees allies as obstacles to be coerced rather than partners to be respected. So watch carefully. Watch how European leaders continue accelerating strategic autonomy. Watch how defense spending patterns shift. Watch how supply chains gradually redirect. Watch how diplomatic language subtly changes. And most importantly, watch for the next crisis, because it's coming. The question isn't if Trump will threaten NATO again. The question is when, over what, and whether next time we'll be lucky enough to step back from the edge. That 2 a.m. post shattered something that can't be fully repaired. Not the formal alliance structure, that remains intact, but the assumption of reliability, the trust that allows alliances to function effectively, the belief that America, whatever its other failings, would always defend its allies rather than threaten them. That assumption is gone. That trust is broken. That belief has been shattered. And in international relations, once you lose those things, they're extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. The $50 trillion alliance survived, but it's been wounded in ways that will take years to fully understand and decades to heal, if they can be healed at all. If you found this breakdown valuable, if understanding what actually happened during those 5 critical days matters to you, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this story isn't over, it's just beginning. And in the comments, I want to hear from you. Do you think NATO will survive Trump's presidency intact? Do you think European strategic autonomy is inevitable now? What happens if Trump makes another Greenland threat? Let me know your thoughts, because this is the conversation we all need to be having while there's still time to shape the outcome. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember that the international order we've taken for granted for 75 years is more fragile than anyone imagined. One social media post published at 2 a.m. almost destroyed it. That should terrify everyone who understands what's at stake.